I came here to give you these facts. It is no concern of ours how you run your own planet. But if you threaten to extend your violence, this Earth of yours will be reduced to a burned-out cinder. Your choice is simple. Join us and live in peace, or pursue your present course and face obliteration. We shall be waiting for your answer. The decision rests with you.
Hello, and welcome to every single sci-fi film ever. I'm Aisha Khan. Before we get started, I just want to point anyone who's new to the show to the show notes. The only full detailed show notes can be found on the website, which is everyscififilm.com. If you head over to the watch page, click the episode you want, and scroll all the way down, and all the detailed show notes will be there. Today we are talking about The Day the Earth Stood Still, made in 1951 by Robert Wise. Robert Wise went on to direct musicals such as The Sound of Music and West Side Story. He was also the editor, very impressively, on Citizen Kane. So today we have two wonderful guests joining me to talk about The Day the Earth Stood Still, which is still to this day, not standing still, but making it onto lists of the greatest films or greatest sci-fi films in many places. First up, Glyn Morgan is Curatorial Lead at the British Science Museum in London, and he put together a really fantastic science fiction exhibition at the museum, which was touring in Hong Kong for a while, but is heading home soon. He also writes quite a bit about science fiction, and I get a feeling he really likes science fiction too. Is this true, Glyn?
Most of the time.
Excellent. Joining Glyn is Peter Gottschalk, who is a professor of religion at Wesleyan University. He has a special interest in the South Asia region, empire and science. And he also teaches a course called Awesome Cinema. Welcome to the show, Peter. How are you?
Thank you so much, Aisha. I'm well, thank you.
Okay, let's go to Glyn first. Can we talk a bit about the history, the origin of this film, which is a story called Farewell to the Master, which, just like The Thing from Another World, came from a story from Astounding Science Fiction magazine, this time from 1940 by a writer called Harry Bates.
Yeah, absolutely. Astounding was a what we would call a pulp magazine now. And it really was a bit of an idea factory at that time. Went through various names: Astounding Science Fiction and Fact, and Astounding Stories of Super Science, and all that kind of stuff. But we just know it as Astounding. It was edited by a number of different people over its time, and is particularly well known for its tenure under John W. Campbell, who introduced us to writers like Asimov and Heinlein and these people who would go on to be, giants of the genre. This is not unusual that short stories would be the source material for a Hollywood script in this way, because Astounding was, very widely read by all sorts of people. Campbell actually had an anecdote that it was probably a lie, but he said that he knew that there was something going on in Los Alamos because suddenly there were all these subscriptions to Astounding that were being rerouted to the middle of nowhere in the desert. And, it's because the scientists were these subscribers, because it was widely read by scientists. And he was like, so there's definitely something going on there. And so he claimed to be able to predict the development of the atomic weapons because of that. But I think that's probably him exaggerating. He was very prone to do that. What is true, though, is that the FBI almost shut them down because An Astounding Story actually did contain details about how to make an atomic weapon, which the author had just worked out from doing his own research. The FBI were worried that someone was leaking. And that it was actually being used, that these secrets had come from Los Alamos. So there is this amazing connection, or maybe astounding connection, between atomic weapons and the science fiction pulps all the way through. And obviously this film is part of that story.
Absolutely. Huge theme all the way through the 50s is the atomic age and the Cold War. And I wonder if that's also why they changed it to Astounding Science Fiction and Fact, because These scientists were maybe getting involved and leaking some information through. So Julian Blaustein was the producer, and he wanted to make a story because he was seeing lots of headlines which were very critical and kind of fear-mongering about the Russians, and it was called the peace offensive. So the Russians were apparently trying to reach out with an olive branch, and the US media was going crazy. And he thought science fiction was the best medium to be able to communicate those kinds of themes. He had Edmund North write the story, which has some kind of Christ-like themes, which we'll get to later. But this was a film that came out the same year as The Thing from Another World. It's got a tradition, you've got this huge pulpy tradition of various stories which are very, like even if you look at the poster for this image, it's kind of got the big Gort robot, laser beams coming out of his eyes, and he's holding a very scantily clad woman. So those kind of pulpy images are what people would most associate with science fiction. But this film kind of changed that whole image to a degree. Do you think that's right, Peter?
Well, I couldn't comment whether it had the effect of changing that entirely, but it certainly became a salient film, as is evident in the popular memory today, where it is remembered to be this really kind of seminal film in terms of presenting a theme in a very serious manner, right? Even though you do still have these horror elements to it, which in the film itself, not just in the advertising, that bespeak that kind of pulpy background, and it is intended to be entertainment after all. Nevertheless, it definitely evidences an early example of how science fiction provides an opportunity to not only speculate about the future, but also to reflect on humanity itself. And that's clearly a major theme throughout, and very much in the context of Cold War, of how World War II ended, of McCarthyism, the Red Scare, and and kind of culminating concerns about where exactly is technology going to lead us, and is humanity really prepared to manage that?
Yeah, you mentioned McCarthyism there, So Jay Talott talks about this film last episode, if you want to go back and listen to that. And he considered the film to be quite preachy. And I can kind of understand that, because there is this very strong overarching message of, peace or else. But at the same time, this is, just 3-4 years after the blacklisting has started in Hollywood, and producers have come out, and 10 directors and writers who have been, held in contempt and convicted. They've disassociated themselves with those and said, we will not hire communists. And that's when the whole McCarthyism era kind of really kicks off in Hollywood. So making a film that's kind of along the lines of let's make peace with the Russians is a very bold statement. Glyn, you were talking a bit about that.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting. I was actually listening to the director speak about the film, and he was asked the same question, and he said that the if we want to call it danger of making the film in the kind of McCarthy era didn't strike him or a lot of other people until afterwards. In retrospect, the Russians are completely absent apart from turning down the summit proposal at the very beginning. And so it's not about making peace with the Russians. It's about, in except the most abstract sense, what it is about using nuclear power, as an alternative option, using nuclear power for good rather than for bad. There's a really interesting moment where Klaatu is at the, revisits the spaceship in his disguise as a human with Bobby, and Bobby's asking all these questions, and it's a great opportunity for some info dumping, one of science fiction's favorite narrative techniques, and he gets to explain how the spaceship works and all this kind of stuff.
I bet that iron guy's strong. I bet he can knock down a whole building.
I shouldn't be at all surprised.
I'd like to get inside that ship, see how it works. What do you think makes it go?
Well, a highly developed form of atomic power, I should imagine.
I thought that was only for bombs.
No, it's for lots of other things, too.
When I was rewatching the film in preparation for this, it made me think about also watching Oppenheimer not that long ago, and the debate that film and Oppenheimer's biography encapsulates, that was very active in both the scientific and civil and political communities post-war for the use of nuclear power and the advocacy for using it for positive, constructive things, not for weapons. And I think it's speaking to that debate more than it's speaking to, trying to reach a detente with the Soviet Union in a lot of ways. I mean, Atoms for Peace comes out, as a movement, comes just a couple of years later. So it's really part of the zeitgeist of the discussion that's going on here. Interesting, you should mention blacklisting as well, by the way, because Sam Jaffe, who plays the scientist in this film, goes on to become a blacklisted actor for his supposed communist sympathies. So it does have the McCarthy shadow over it, but indirectly.
That's really interesting. I missed that. I wanted to go on to the sci-fi credentials of this film, because we've come through the 40s. There's not been a lot of sci-fi apart from a few bunch of mad scientist films and a few random things here and there. People are still getting over the kind of the end of World War II, the nuclear bomb. And so 1951, we just get the beginning of what's going to be an absolute explosion, is the only way I can think about it, of these science fiction B movies. And it has a few things which are very, very sci-fi. So first of all, the flying saucer.
Yeah.
Glyn, let's go with you.
Oh, I mean, what an icon for science fiction. It's it will go on and continue to be an iconic image, the idea of the flying saucer. And, people still are arguing about flying saucers and trying to get stuff declassified and all sorts of really interesting discussions at the moment about flying saucers, UFOs. Contextual stuff here. This is just after Roswell. The idea of flying saucers is very ripe in the American cultural imagination at the moment. And it's really interesting if you listen to the radio broadcasty bits at the beginning where the news reporters are kind of building up the kind of the hype that of the public response to this event, which I think is actually really effectively done. Possibly
and in multi languages and stuff. I like that.
Yeah.
हमें अभी एक बुलेटिन मिली है जिससे ये पता चलता है कि एक बड़ी चीज पर्वत से पश्चिम की तरफ उड़ती जा रही है.
Information jusqu'à présent laisse penser qu'il s'agit d'une fusée téléguidée. S'agit-il d'une bombe planante ou de troupes aéroportées? C'est ce que nous ne savons pas encore.
Reports are coming in from all over the empire, from all over the world. The government has not yet issued any statement, but there seems to be no question that there actually is a large unidentified object circling the Earth at incredible speed.
This is Elmer Davis again. We still don't know what it is or where it comes from, but there's something there.
One of the reasons it works so well is probably because a lot of those radio presenters are actual radio news presenters that they got in for the film. So that, they have that. To Americans in the 50s, they would have been recognizable cameos, which is kind of cool. But yeah, so it's coming straight out of Roswell and the kind of the interests in UFOs and flying saucers.
One of the things that changes from the story, because they don't have a flying saucer in the story because it's from 1940, and then 1947 Roswell and the flying saucer craze, which apparently there were over 800, as I mentioned in the last episode, reportings and sightings of flying saucers in the US in 1947. And so suddenly they're not going to have a rocket ship coming down, but they're going to have the very sleek and nice looking flying saucer, which, by the way, was one of the many I used when I was about to come up with a logo for the show, which is really relevant. But yeah, the flying saucer, quite iconic. And Peter, can we talk a little bit about the alien? Because you mentioned when we had our little chat that there's something quite appealing to you about just difference, and you found that quite, attractive as a child.
Yeah, I was saying that as a child, exposed to a variety of different types of genre films and television shows and consuming a lot of it, that I was particularly attracted to what what anthropologists do, which is media that makes familiar the unfamiliar and makes the unfamiliar familiar, because it provides a kind of curiosity puzzle for the mind in terms of thinking about things in different ways, turning things upside down or inverting them or turning them inside out, and getting us to think a little bit more about it. And so Klaatu is this interesting figure because he represents this incredibly advanced group of people. He looks familiar as a humanoid, but at the same time, he's clearly, and the film delights in showing us repeatedly how far advanced he is technologically and in terms of science, with his constant knowing smiles and then sidestepping problems.
I kind of see him as this kind of benevolent invader. And I can tell that the film, well, I feel that the film is very much like he's the good guy and all of us stupid humans are the bad guys in effect, compared to this wise, enlightened person who's come to warn us about our future. But there is a part of me that's like, I don't know if I trust this guy coming off the ship with a big robot telling us we better do what he says. And so I mean, I'm ultimately human, I suppose, but there is quite something quite threatening about that.
Yeah, I think that it's understandable you'd feel that way. I think many audiences probably have that experience. I see the film, although it fits into the genre of science fiction with tinges of horror, as really ultimately a morality tale. I think that's really what seems to be being communicated, at least to me, is it's a reflection about human morality, and it uses a character who's not, I don't know if he identifies himself as human or not, but he's not of the earth, right? So he provides this kind of foil against which we can kind of judge. But at the same time, an important other historical contextual theme here is the United Nations, right? And so what he's offering is something of what the United Nations is offering, right? So preceding the United Nations after World War I was the League of Nations, which proved really ineffective. The United Nations tries to do something different in the ruins of World War II, including having a police force, right? As long as the Security Council okays that. And that police force is put into, there are observers on the India-Pakistan border. That's the first use of UN observers. But there's actually armed United Nations incursion in Korea during the Korean conflict beginning in 1950. So in some ways, the film is very proactively petitioning its audience to consider the importance of having a police force that will be outside of anybody's political interests in order to enforce peace.
The League of Nations did fail. And I can understand why something like the United Nations after Hitler and the whole, World War II thing would have been very, very appealing. Yeah. Any thoughts on the benevolent invader, Glyn?
Yeah, it's a funny thing, isn't it? Because, that's where I think part of the preachiness perhaps comes through to modern viewers. There's something kind of disarmingly earnest about Klaatu, and I think Michael Rennie as the actor who plays him is just so wonderful. There's something he delivers a kind of human alien performance so well. He both blends into that family environment or the lodger's environment that he puts himself into, and yet is also apart from it. Like, I think he's kind of the secret weapon of the film in a lot of ways. But there's also really weird bits, like, Bobby declaring that he's my best friend. It's like, you just met this strange older man that you're now hanging around with. Like, that date's a little bit odd.
My alarm bells were ringing. But I think that's the thing in the film, that you are shown something by it's weird because it goes into filmmaking. You're shown something by the film, and I suppose to some degree you're supposed to accept that. But as viewers, there's the intention and there's the interpretation, and if I was going out and a stranger was like, "Oh yeah, I'll look after your, son who's probably around 9," like, no, it's fine. He's just going to come with me. So there are these strange kind of lapses in human reaction, but I totally agree. He's so wonderful in it because he gets bewildered by us, and you can tell he thinks we're nuts, but he's never kind of outraged by that. He's always kind of like, "You people are strange," but there's no kind of anger. It's all contained quite well.
Yeah, I completely agree.
So moving on, we want to talk about Gort, because I get them confused because he's called Gort in this, but he's called Gnut or Newt in the book. So Gort the robot, who is just so cool even now. At the time, I'm sure they probably didn't have toys of Gort because he's not like very friendly, but a very, very impressive silver, shiny robot. And Glyn, you were saying that they were quite clever in how they underused him to make him look quite impressive.
Yeah, I think so. I think he's the monster in the monster movie, if we're going into the kind of science fiction cliches, particularly of the time. But it's very restrained, I mean, part of that is the limitations of what you can do in a massive neoprene suit. But they understand that potential practical limitation. And so, for most of the film, he's literally a statue just standing there. And I say literally because they built a statue that stood there. The actor didn't have to stand still the whole time. So, yeah, I think they were very clever. And, the close-ups of him or it, so does Gort have a gender? As the visor opens and the laser kind of gets brighter and brighter before it vaporizes the weapons and everything. It's all very well done. It is part of the way in which this film is actually just very well put together and directed, and you can see why Robert Weiss goes on to such great acclaim and much bigger films, and why he was tapped for Star Trek: The Motion Picture, for example. So yeah, but Gort, there's something really impressively other about him. He's human enough, it's anthropoid, but still very different. I mean, he's massive. They've got a very tall actor in there called Locke Martin, who was like 7 foot something, and then they gave him lifts. So he's a big guy, and the fact that it's like seamless as well, which I was reading like apparently. Ship. Yeah, exactly. So the any boundaries and borders just disappear, which is obviously very kind of futuristic and strange. And apparently they did that by having 2 suits, one that laces up the front and one that laces up the back, depending on which way it's being filmed from. He's wearing one of the 2 suits. I find it interesting. Maybe that's the museum
I just can imagine it being laced up now.
Yeah, I know. Well, it's the same disconcerting thing when you see the actor who played the alien in Alien with the head off, and he's like hanging out backstage. There is one photo that I've seen of Locke Martin peeking through Gort's helmet from inside. So there are little backstage images and things like that.
Okay, and the other interesting thing is in the story, the big twist, spoilers ahead always in these shows, the big twist is that it's the robot who is in control. So I can understand why they didn't put that in the film, but that's quite an interesting early example of, human anxieties around robots, AI, mechanization.
There's a form of it in the film. Like when Klaatu is explaining everything in his kind of final speech to the assembled masses at the end of the film, he does say that that the police in this United Nations of other planets are not people like him. They are Gort, and that they have given themselves over fully to them. So they have surrendered some autonomy to these robots, and for whatever reason, he is able to rein Gort in to stop Gort from, killing everybody on arrival. But the implication is that won't be possible in the long term. So there is an element of that still in the film, but yeah, they obviously switch it around so that they can have a much more kind of charismatic lead, and
perhaps. Then it's actually we should, instead of we'll talk about the remake later, but maybe we should have made a remake where it's actually Klaatu who is stuck in some kind of Stockholm syndrome, and there is this police force, because I'm still very wary of Klaatu and his whole gang. Peter, what do you think about the robot and his, this police force that he represents?
Yeah, I think the film is very sophisticated in the way it goes about presenting Gort as a menacing figure. The music changes dramatically when he comes on the scene. Gort and his robotic colleagues are in control of this police force, but at the same time, Klaatu is giving the orders, right? He's telling Gort that he's telling him to stand down, basically through Mrs. Benson, and so there's an interesting way in which the film isn't willing to kind of give over everything to the robotic overlords, but it's a sense that this is something of. I think of the parallel again is like with the United Nations. This is something of human construction, like the United Nations police force, and it's something that should operate independently. But to make it not entirely frightful, there's still a certain degree of humanoid control.
Gort, Klaatu, Barada, Nikto. Klaatu, Barada, Nikto.
Klaatu, Baradu, Nikto, which is, you might have an oppressive police force, but if you've got those 3 words, you're good.
And a good flashlight to communicate as well.
Absolutely. Okay. And now, because I absolutely love the mad scientist trope, we have a very sane scientist in this film, which is slightly different.
Yeah, Professor Barnhart. And I mean, if you had no doubts just by reading the script about which scientist this is supposed to sort of represent as like the brightest of the bright, you only have to look at Sam Jaffe's hair and be like, oh, you're supposed to be Einstein. I get it. Yes. I think there's something there. Einstein was famously, anti-nuclear war and very much came to, despite having co-signed the letter that kicked off the whole Manhattan Project. He very much came to opposing opinions with the American government and the military over their kind of approach to the post-war world. So, that kind of analog, I think, is kind of deliberately baked in.
It's interesting that there's another subtext, I think, that the movie communicates, whether intentionally or not, that it's not the science that's the problem. It's the humans who wield it. And it's not the scientists, right? The film seems to go out of its way to show, indeed, as Glyn said, this kind of friendly scientist, empathetic scientist, a scientist who says, we scientists are too often ignored or misunderstood, right? So he's dubious when Klaatu suggests that there should be a gathering of scientists to communicate his message. Well, we shouldn't just have scientists right? So the film kind of recognizes that that scientists sometimes can get blamed for these sort of things, that the science can be blamed for it. And it seems like it's going out of its way, again, with some of the lines that Glyn had mentioned before in terms of atomic power being used to propel a spaceship across the skies and to different planets and put them in communication with one another. And also power, presumably, the robot that's going to destroy the planet if things don't go well. But the bottom line is it's about the problems of human choice and human motivation. So I find that to be a really interesting subtext that kind of comes together personified by Dr. Barnhart.
And also the scientists who assemble at the end, they're very careful to frame those shots to show that there is a range of people from all over the world. So while the political leaders couldn't get together to have this summit and weren't willing to do that, the implication is that the scientists have come from all over the world. And of course, there was scientific collaboration across the Iron Curtain. So that, it's again saying something about science being bigger than petty politics and the kind of flaws of man.
Absolutely, yeah. I wanted to go on to the idea of the theme of the Christ-like figure, which is quite apparent in this film. And according to screenwriter Edmund North, it was done quite purposely. He said, I had originally hoped that the Christ comparison would be subliminal, which I find slightly hard to believe. Peter, do you want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, so it's interesting that was so much on his mind when Robert Wise, as director, later at least in one interview that I saw, was very adamant that he did not have the religious themes in mind whatsoever when he filmed this film, and he really pushes back on that. So I think that the image of the character of Jesus Christ in the American imagination in general, not just the American Christian imagination, is playing out in many ways here. That if we talk about Jesus as a mythic figure, and I don't mean it to myth here as being like a false story or something that those people believe and we know better. I don't mean it that way. I mean myth here in the sense that a story that is absolutely at the core of the way in which a culture kind of interprets the world, a narrative that has profound social power to it. And so it's not surprising that Jesus then arrives as a kind of a hero figure in many expressions in American popular imagination, including in this film. At the same time, I kind of see the imprint as being similar to like the notion of flying saucers. So when the first report of flying object in the sky that gets called flying saucers was not described as a flying saucer by the pilot, the civilian pilot who saw it in 47 or 48. It was just, he described them as like crescents flying through the sky. But the media picked it up and started applying this term to saucer. And so suddenly flying saucer is the term. It's like the mythic, iconic image that we have of alien visitors. And so I think the Jesus story, as communicated through the Gospels, but then sorted through American culture very generally, plays a similar sort of thing where, yes, certain viewers are going to see Jesus, and indeed the screenwriter may indeed have Jesus in mind very much. But this isn't a Jesus that maps terribly well onto what many American Christians are thinking of Jesus, because this is a Jesus who's threatening to incinerate the planet. So even in an apocalyptic Jesus, I'm not sure that we see necessarily like the threat of total destruction. Now, that's
a really good point.
The day of judgment, Jesus, everybody is held accountable for their sins. And so one can say, well, maybe this is that Jesus. Well, here there's a corporate responsibility. Little Bobby and Mrs. Benson and Professor Barnhart, who seem to be all fairly innocent folks, are going to be burned to a cinder, as well as Nasty Tom and the Colonel and all of the folks who are working in bad faith here.
I suppose hellfire might be comparable, but I just wanted to go through the reasons why the Jesus Christ analogy exists. So first of all, biggest thing to me is the resurrection. So he dies and he's resurrected, admittedly by Gort the robot, but there is a resurrection there. He comes with a message for peace for all mankind, and when he steals the outfit from a John Carpenter, he's got the initials JC as well as Jesus being a carpenter. So, and also he's persecuted. So those are all the reasons why people, and I imagine Edmund North himself, thought that it was a Jesus-like, Christ-like figure. I find it quite interesting, actually, because when Helen, who's played by Patricia Neal, who's the kind of main woman in the story, says to him, she asks him whether he has power over life and death, and he replies, and apparently this was added afterwards, that power is reserved to the Almighty Spirit. And this was apparently added later. Now, I haven't been able to find out if that was needed to be added to, was it down a blasphemy route that they wanted to clarify, or was it more to do with a potentially communist thing? Because, religion is something that is kind of in opposition to kind of the scary Red Scare communists. So any ideas on that?
Yeah, I think it was the Fox censor who insisted on that line and said that without that line, that whole scene isn't happening. What the motivation for that was, I don't know. I mean, you might have a better sense of it, Peter. I always assumed that it was more of a blasphemy thing than a communist thing. Yeah,
I don't know what the motivation for that was, but I do think it's important to note that it was the technology that does the work. It's not Klaatu himself who self-generates himself, which would be more fitting to the gospel stories, right?
Mm.
There is one other element as well to the story. You could also read Mr. Stevens as a kind of Judas figure, because ultimately Klaatu only dies because of being betrayed by someone in his own house. So
interesting. I just wanted to mention the the role of the media in this, and I think it's done really well. And I think a lot of old films do the kind of media thing quite well. I think even the Ready Play War of the Worlds, anything even before and after that. But in this, there's a lot of fear-mongering, a lot of talk, even within that household, about who they think is really behind it, loads of rumours, loads of gossip. Peter, you said that part of it appealed to you very much.
It really stood out to me. I don't remember a science fiction film in which the media played as prominent a role without being about news media, right? But the scene that really grabbed my attention was near the beginning when the news reporter is reporting, and indeed he's an actual news reporter. He's reporting, and he has a microphone in front of him like for a radio, and next to him is a television, which is just really fascinating, right? And the camera is centered on the television, even as he's there in the frame as well. And then the camera zooms in on the television, and we really enter into the scene of the ship on the mall in DC. And then it becomes our vision.
We still do not know where it came from. The ship is now resting exactly where it landed 2 hours ago. And so far, there is no sign of life from inside it. Troops have been rushed across the Potomac River from Fort Myer and have thrown a cordon around the ship.
And I thought that was an incredibly powerful camera move in order to kind of demonstrate the ways in which the news media creates the image for us. And it's just relentless throughout the entire film. We constantly are seeing people reading newspapers and showing up images, centerfold in the newspaper of the world coming apart because of alien invasion. The emphasis on media, which of course tracks with McCarthyism and the media hype around the threat of communists in America.
Absolutely interesting. Glyn, anything to add to that?
Yeah, only that I agree that it's a really interesting part of the film and used in a really clever way, I think, to kind of build out the scope and scale of the reaction beyond, the limited crowd that we see in DC and those few actually very clever shots of the world stood still from all over the world. One of the things I like is, you've mentioned this comes out the same year as Thing from Another Planet. There's very faintly, I think just after he first escapes from the hospital, you can hear a radio broadcast. There's a reporter saying, that police are looking out, authorities are looking out for this alien. He's not 8 feet tall as reported, nor does he have tentacles. And just kind of emphasizing the status of this film as kind of subverting that idea of the alien invader and the kind of the alien monster, because that is such a trope of the representation of that kind of figure, and this is actually very strange to have this humanoid, very human, even down to a biological level. They do the x-rays and everything, and he's got all the same organs in all the same places. Even Doctor Who, the Doctor has 2 hearts. It's very strange, and in science fiction at this time, to have an alien that is so familiar, which he needs to be empathic and have that sense that we can buy into his message, but that's not the norm yet. And I think that's quite interesting that it goes so far as to emphasize it through its use of the media.
Because you've mentioned the fact that it's humanoid, I think we'll talk about the remake briefly right now. And because in that they actually address the fact that he's, he looks human because that him being Keanu Reeves in the 2008 remake, because he's trying to speak with us, and it's something that he's done to alter himself. Whereas it's never questioned in the original one. And admittedly, way back then, I guess we just accepted what we were given in terms of aliens. We didn't have like lots of Klingons and Cardassians and whatnot to kind of deal with. Can you talk a little bit about the remake, Glyn?
It is interesting, the changes that they make. So, I quite like that if you're going to remake this film for the modern age, that they chose to make it about the climate crisis and the damage we're doing to the planet, rather than the threat of nuclear war, which at least for a little while in the turn of the century felt like maybe it was receding into the background, maybe not so much anymore. And casting Keanu Reeves seems to make a lot of sense. He, especially at that time, was had this reputation for being this kind of like otherly, kind of detached character. The change they make to actually Klaatu in that story that you're referencing, that I think Keanu says in an interview somewhere that he played it as an alien or a man with an alien looking out, rather than a man that looks like an alien that looks like a man, which is how it originally was. And I guess, yeah, you're right that kind of adds a logic that is supposed to make it more of a buy-in for modern viewers. But back in in the 50s, there was nothing unusual about representing Martians as being in literature and art anyway, as being human-like. Perhaps they've got red skin or something, but other than that, because otherwise, how else can they come over here and steal our women, which is a major part of the representation of aliens in a lot of pulp fiction. So yeah, and obviously they changed Gort a lot. He's now colossal, and there's a lot of extra padding that's inserted in. I don't think it's a very successful remake. I don't think it's a film that really needs to be remade in the same way, unlike its compatriot in the year, because The Thing obviously is a superb remake, and really kind of builds on that original 1951 film in a much more interesting way, and uses the effects those innovations in effects and cinematography to really milk that story and get the most out of it.
And although Carpenter's very inspired by the original film, it is because he goes back to the original source material,
which I think is probably key.
Yeah. Peter, any thoughts on the 2008 remake?
I think for all of its faults, I enjoyed seeing the twist that it put on it in terms of indeed the environmental theme, but also that judgment has been passed and the Earth is in the midst of being deconstructed and annihilated. Although saving the animals. So here, it's only the humans that are going to suffer the problems, because there's going to be some sort of arc that's going to protect the animals. So that's an interesting twist, which we didn't get in the original. The interesting thing is then judgment is made, and then it's held only because the action that we never get to see in the original is actually enacted. So the action that's necessary to save humanity is put into place, which is that all power is cut off permanently, right? We don't see whether or not humans figure things out. And in fact, in the first movie, it's all about human agency. In the second movie, it's only about really one person's choice, right? And then that speaks for all of humanity is saved, but powerless. So it's a very different film with a very different kind of moral conclusion.
Absolutely. Thank you. I just wanted to quickly mention the music in this, because it's Bernard Herrmann, who is very well known for doing a lot of Hitchcock films. So he's the composer for films including Psycho, The Man Who Knew Too Much, Vertigo, North by Northwest. He also goes on to do Cape Fear and Taxi Driver. And in this, he uses an unusual array of instruments.
Just a minute, ladies and gentlemen. I think something is happening.
I have heard it claimed that this is the first time a theremin is used in a film, but that's not true. It's actually Hitchcock's Spellbound from 1945, although it's not Hermann who uses it. And I think Jay had mentioned the theremin in The Thing from Another World episode. And that is actually not a theremin, is what I discovered. It's just something that sounds like a theremin. So they've got a few strings and they've got a few people wailing, and they've made that, I assume they've distorted it to sound like a theremin, but this is considered very, very seminal in terms of sci-fi music, and that theremin sound will be very, very prevalent over the next decade and probably even more. So have to give a big kind of nod to Bernard Herrmann there. Moving on, I want to talk about the legacy of this film. So, Glyn, why don't you go first?
Wow, the legacy of this. I mean, for one, the theremin, that pairing of the theremin and the flying saucer, that is, I think that's why people often think it was the first, because it's the first one to create that sci-fi classic pairing. But you see the legacy of this film throughout the next few decades, very specifically, through the representation of flying saucers, but also other robots. Robbie the robot, would he exist in the same way later in the 1950s if it weren't for Gort? I'm not sure. I mean, certainly the poster depicts Robbie carrying a scantily clad woman in exactly the same way as The Day the Earth Stood Still. So it is a film that goes on to be very influential, both with audiences, but also with the people making science fiction. And it continues to resurface, which I think is the interesting thing about it. I mean, even Ringo Starr references it on one of his album covers. So it just kind of keeps coming back. And I think that that's one of the reasons it doesn't really need a remake. It's not some film that people have forgotten about and is only known to a niche audience. This is a film that people still seek out and watch. And I think a lot of that is down to the quality of the actors and the quality of the way that it's been put together by Robert Weiss. Because it still holds up very well, I think.
Peter, your thoughts on the legacy of this film?
Yeah, I really can see two legacies. One is the ways in which, in some ways, the Jesus theme gets picked up in some other media productions. So, for instance, there's a Twilight Zone episode called The Gift in 1962, in which you have a very Klaatu-like character come with a gift, actually, of being able to a recipe for a drug that would heal all diseases. And things do not go well, and there is no resurrection scene, but it's pretty clearly a Jesus kind of character. And then you also have this notion of the benevolent alien who comes to help. So, for instance, in Star Trek's episode, The Assignment Earth, in the late 60s, we have a human who was taken by aliens to be trained in order to intercede in human history in order to avoid certain things. So he's involved in a mission to stop a nuclear device from being put into space. So there's this interesting intervention. And then, of course, 2001 picks up on that theme as well, pretty much at the same time. And Arthur C. Clarke bounces off of the screenplay in order to write a novel in which, again, a nuclear device is what is curtailed by the use of a transformed human that aliens put into place. I guess the other thing that the second part that I think is particularly interesting is the appeal that this film might have, because we're still stuck with this moral quandary. Are humans up to the task of managing the technology that they've devised? So the film occurs in the nuclear scare. Then we have the environmental scare, the impact of chemicals, and that continues with the impact of plastics. And now we're facing AI, artificial intelligence, and what are going to be the ramifications for that? So I think this film continues to speak to audiences because there is no clear answer. And then the apocalyptic outcomes, not of Jesus showing up, but of the technological choices that humans make are still very relevant.
Yeah, we're a messy bunch, us humans. That's definitely still true.
I think there's something in the idea of the kind of interstellar police force element, which really gets picked up on as well. I was just thinking about another Aliens Come to Earth and Pass Judgment story, which comes out just a couple of years later, Childhood's End by Arthur C. Clarke, which again is an alien comes down and kind of passes judgment on us. In that case, to kind of nurture us and help us, leave our childhood and ascend to the next stage of evolution. But Clarke had to have been influenced by this film in that setup, and also there's something kind of like the Prime Directive in Star Trek feels like it's sort of a mirror version of what's going on here as well. So, once you start to kind of tease it out, you'll find the kind of parallels and the little nods, I think, throughout the texture of this particularly American science fiction over the next few decades.
It's interesting, actually, because right now I'm reading my first ever Ursula K. Le Guin book, which is The Left Hand of Darkness. And it shows how biased I am myself, because when I'm reading The Left Hand of Darkness, I'm totally with the Terran, the Earth being that's gone into this planet and is that the envoy. But when I'm watching The Day the Earth Stood Still, I'm like, don't trust him. Don't trust him. So I am part of the problem. So I really appreciate that there are people out there trying to solve this problem. I would like to be less like that, but it's interesting. I have human bias. Okay, so what I like to end the podcast with is a recommendation for listeners on what they can pair with this film and the podcast. Peter, can you go first this time?
Well, I think the two the three shows and films that I just mentioned would be really worth pairing, because they all have their own interesting twists on this notion of aliens helping humanity out in ways that humanity might actually resist in some way.
Interesting. Glyn?
I'll just suggest that Clarke novel again, Trouter's End. I would also point people towards my second choice, Day the Earth film, The Day the Earth Caught Fire, which is perhaps not that well known, but it's from 1961, so 10 years later, and is actually a really amazing story, very much about the media. I think the main character is a journalist for, the News of the World. But the Earth stands still in a completely different way, and again is a very much a nuclear war film, or anti-nuclear war film, that has a kind of relevance to the climate message now. I can't wait for you to get to the next decade and be able to do an episode on that. And then maybe pair it with something like Dr. Strangelove, to see why we need an alien to come down here and kind of teach us not to be such idiots.
Yeah. No, when I watch Dr. Strangelove, I'm not on the side of the humans. No, you're right.
No, exactly. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your time, guys. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you so much, Aisha.
Absolute pleasure as always.
Great. That's it for this episode. Before you leave, if you have a chance, please do give this podcast a rating or a review, as it really helps me out. Aside from that, you're going to have to check the show notes on which film we're covering next, because I'm still deciding and I have a few more to watch. And apart from that, thank you for listening, thank you for sharing, and I'll see you again next time. Bye-bye.